The Texas sun is a relentless thing, even in late October. But out here in my garden, kneeling on the damp earth of our Austin suburb, I always found my peace. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 69 years old, and for 42 of those years, I believed I was the invisible but vital anchor of a beautiful, unshakable life. I was pruning the heritage roses, my prized Chrysler Imperials, when the first real shadow fell over my marriage. I didn't know it then, of course. Betrayal rarely announces itself with a megaphone. It creeps in through the hairline fractures of your daily routine. It arrives in the form of a slightly altered schedule, a new brand of aftershave, a gaze that looks through you rather than at you. My hands, calloused from decades of soil and shears, carefully snipped a withered bloom. I remember looking at my hands that afternoon. They were the hands of a woman who had built things. When people in our affluent community talked about Vance Estate landscaping, they talked about my husband, Harrison. They praised his vision, his charisma, the way he could walk onto a barren plot of dirt and see a multi-million-dollar oasis. Harrison was the charismatic CEO, the man in the tailored linen suits who shook hands at the country club and closed deals over expensive bourbon. But the secret of our success, the truth known only to the four walls of our kitchen, was that Harrison couldn't draw a straight line with a ruler. In the early days, when we had nothing but a rusted Ford pickup and a mountain of debt, it was me sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. With a sleeping toddler strapped to my chest, I was the one with the architectural drafting paper, the charcoal, and the vision. I designed the cascading water features, the drought-resistant ecological layouts, the intricate limestone patios that became the signature of Vance Estate landscaping. I surrendered my own dreams of a formal architecture degree to be his quiet partner, his sounding board, his wife. I was the roots. He was the magnificent flowering branches. And for 4 decades, I thought that was enough. That evening, I heard the heavy thud of Harrison's luxury SUV pulling into the driveway. Usually, he would come through the back patio, loosen his silk tie, kiss my cheek, and ask what smelled so good on the stove. But things had been shifting over the past 8 months. The changes were microscopic at first. A sudden obsession with his fitness, resulting in early morning gym sessions. A wardrobe overhaul. Gone were the comfortable khakis, replaced by slim-fit European trousers that seemed entirely out of place on a 71-year-old man, no matter how silver and distinguished his hair was. The back door opened and he walked in. He didn't look at the kitchen, and he didn't look at me. He was staring intently at his phone, his thumb swiping rapidly. "Dinner will be ready in 10, Harrison," I called out, wiping my hands on my apron. "Pot roast. Your favorite." Oh," he muttered, finally glancing up. His blue eyes, which used to crinkle at the corners when he saw me, seemed glassy, preoccupied. "Actually, Ellie, I can't. I have to jump on a conference call with the suppliers. Grabbed a bite at the club." He walked past me, and that's when it hit me. The scent. For 40 years, Harrison had smelled of cedarwood, Irish spring soap, and occasionally the rich aroma of unroasted coffee beans. But the man walking past me smelled of something entirely foreign. It wasn't a cheap, overpowering perfume. It was subtle, expensive, and undeniably feminine. Sandalwood, bergamot, and a hint of vanilla. A young woman's fragrance. "Harrison," I sassy said, my voice catching slightly. He paused on the bottom step of the staircase, his hand resting on the polished oak banister. "What is it, Ellie? I'm in a rush." "You smell different." He didn't flinch. He didn't stutter. His composure was terrifyingly perfect. "New cologne. The guy at the department store said the old one was making me smell like a grandfather. We're pitching the new tech campus project next week, Ellie. I need to project vitality, not retirement." He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Don't wait up." I stood alone in my kitchen, the warmth of the oven doing nothing to chase away the sudden icy chill in my veins. You don't live with a man for 42 years without learning to read the microscopic shifts in his breathing, the specific cadence of his lies. The denial was instantaneous and fierce. "You're being a paranoid old woman," I told myself. "He's stressed. He's 71, facing the twilight of his career. It's just a midlife or late-life crisis." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and like any experienced gardener, I knew that once a weed takes root, it chokes the life out of everything else if left unchecked. 2 days later, the second fracture appeared. I was at my desk in our home office, organizing the household bills. Even though Vance Estate Landscaping had grown into a regional empire, I still liked to handle our personal checking account. It kept me grounded. As I logged into our joint banking portal, an anomaly glared back at me. A withdrawal. $45,000. Transferred out to an account I didn't recognize. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. $45,000 wasn't pocket change, even for us. I picked up the phone and dialed Harrison's direct line at the office. "Harrison Vance," his voice boomed through the speaker, radiating professional confidence. "Harrison, it's me. I was just paying the property taxes and I saw a transfer. $45,000 was moved out of our joint savings yesterday. Was our account compromised?" There was a pause on the line, just a fraction of a second, but loud enough to deafen me. "Ellie, honey, no. The account is fine," he said, his tone instantly shifting into the soothing, slightly condescending register he used when explaining complex business matters to me. "I moved that money." "To where? For what?" He let out an exaggerated sigh. "It's a high-yield, short-term investment vehicle, a private opportunity that came across my desk. We're preparing for the retirement transition, remember? You don't need to worry your pretty head about it. It's a complex tax deferral strategy." Your pretty head. He hadn't used that phrase since 1985. It was a phrase meant to pacify, to belittle, to shut a door in my face. $45,000 is a lot of money to move without discussing it with your wife, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing its usual softness. "Eleanor, please." His voice hardened, the soothing veneer cracking. "I am trying to secure our future. I run a multi-million-dollar corporation. I think I know how to manage a mutual fund. I have to go. Vanessa is waiting for me in the boardroom." He hung up before I could ask who Vanessa was. I sat in the quiet office, staring at the screen. For years, I had willingly stepped into the shadows so he could shine. I had raised our 2 children, Matthew and Clara, managing their fevers, their heartbreaks, their college applications, while Harrison built his empire on the foundation of my designs. I had excused his absences, his missed anniversaries, his temper tantrums, all in the name of the business. But a wife knows. Deep in the marrow of her bones, she knows when the man in her bed has become a stranger. The following Friday, the phantom took physical form. Harrison called me at noon, his voice jovial, completely erasing the tension of our previous phone call. "Ellie, darling, change of plans for dinner tonight. I'm bringing someone home. We need to discuss the restructuring of the firm, and I want her to experience some of your legendary hospitality." "Her?" I asked, my grip tightening on the kitchen counter. "Vanessa Hayes. She's the new independent financial consultant we brought on board. Brilliant mind. She's helping me navigate the transition so I can finally step back and spend my golden years with you." When the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock, I wiped my hands, smoothed down my tailored dress, and went to open it. I don't know what I expected. Perhaps a flashy, stereotypical young woman with too much makeup and inappropriate clothing. But the woman standing next to my husband on our porch was nothing like that. Vanessa Hayes was 36, but she carried herself with the terrifying poise of a predator. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue pantsuit that practically screamed aggressive competence. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, no-nonsense chignon. She wasn't just beautiful, she was sharp, polished, and exuded an aura of absolute control. "Mrs. Vance," Vanessa said, extending a manicured hand. Her grip was firm, almost competitive. "It is such an honor to finally meet you. Harrison speaks of you constantly. He says you are the absolute heart of this home." Of this home. The distinction was subtle but deliberate. She was establishing the boundaries. I was the domestic keeper. She was the corporate equal. "Welcome, Vanessa. Please call me Eleanor," I said, forcing a warm, gracious smile. "Come in. Dinner is nearly ready." That dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare, dressed up as polite conversation. We sat in our formal dining room, the crystal chandelier casting a warm glow over the roasted tenderloin and asparagus I had spent hours preparing. Harrison poured the wine, an expensive Cabernet. As he filled Vanessa's glass, I watched their interaction. It wasn't what they said. It was the rhythm of their movements. There is a choreography to intimacy. The way Harrison didn't need to ask if she wanted more water. The way Vanessa subtly anticipated the end of his sentences, nodding before he even finished his thought. "The roasted tenderloin is absolutely divine, Eleanor," Vanessa said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Harrison told me you were a traditionalist in the kitchen, but this is restaurant quality. You must spend all your time in here. I enjoy cooking, I replied smoothly, meeting her gaze. But I also enjoy my time in the garden and reading. I used to do quite a bit of architectural drafting, actually. Harrison chuckled, waving his fork dismissively. Oh, Ellie, that was 40 years ago. Doodle sketches on napkins. Vanessa here is dealing with the real architecture, financial architecture. She's restructuring the entire equity model of Vance Estate. Is that so? I looked at Vanessa. And how are you finding the company's financial health, Vanessa? Robust, Vanessa smiled, her dark eyes locking onto mine. But slightly archaic. Harrison has built an incredible legacy, but it needs modernizing. We're moving assets, creating new tax shelters. It's about protecting the king on the chessboard, so to speak. She took a sip of her wine, and as she lowered the glass, she shifted in her chair. That was when I saw it. My napkin had slipped from my lap. As I ducked my head under the table to retrieve it, my eyes caught a glimpse of their feet. Beneath the heavy mahogany of the dining table, in the shadow where polite society doesn't look, Vanessa had slipped her foot out of her designer pump. Her silk-stockinged toe was resting casually, intimately, against the inside of my husband's calf. Harrison's leg didn't flinch away. It leaned into the touch. I stayed under the table for 2 seconds longer than necessary, forcing the air into my lungs. The oxygen felt like powdered glass. I gripped the linen napkin, my knuckles turning white, praying that my face wouldn't betray the absolute devastation ripping through my chest. When I sat back up, my smile was perfectly fixed. I looked at the man I had loved since I was 27 years old, the man who had held my hand in the delivery room, the man whose parents I had buried, the man whose empire I had sketched out on a greasy kitchen table. He was looking at Vanessa with a mixture of awe and hunger that he hadn't directed at me in a decade. The enemy wasn't hiding in the shadows. The enemy was sitting at my antique dining table, drinking my expensive wine, eating the food I had cooked, and rubbing her foot against my husband's leg. And my husband had brought her here, arrogant enough to believe that the old, naive wife would be too blind or too stupid to notice. The rest of the evening was a blur of polite laughter and excruciating small talk. When Harrison finally walked Vanessa to her car in the driveway, I stood by the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard my wrists ached. I watched them through the window. They didn't kiss. They were too smart for that. But as Vanessa opened her car door, Harrison placed a hand on her lower back, a gesture of ownership, of deep, familiar possession. When he came back inside, he was humming. Well, that was a success, he declared, loosening his tie. She really enjoyed the meal, Ellie. You outdid yourself. I turned to face him, the dishcloth in my hand feeling heavy as lead. Is she the high-yield investment, Harrison? He stopped dead in his tracks. The humming ceased. The jovial mask slipped, replaced instantly by a cold, hard glare. Excuse me? The $45,000, the new suits, the gym, the cologne, and now the foot under my dining room table. My voice was eerily calm. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. I was a 69-year-old woman looking at the ruins of her life, and a strange, terrifying clarity was settling over me. Are you sleeping with her, Harrison? For a moment, the silence in the kitchen was absolute. Only the hum of the refrigerator filled the void. I expected him to deny it. I expected him to call me crazy, to gaslight me, to weave another elaborate lie. But Harrison Vance was a proud, arrogant man, and he had clearly decided he was tired of pretending. He looked at me, really looked at me, and his eyes were entirely devoid of love. They were the eyes of a businessman assessing a depreciating asset. You want the truth, Eleanor? He said, his voice quiet, devoid of emotion. Yes, I am seeing Vanessa. We've been together for 8 months. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Even when you know, hearing the words is a different kind of agony. 8 months, I whispered, the words scraping against my throat. Under my nose, while you slept in my bed. Don't be melodramatic, he sighed, walking over to the liquor cabinet and pouring himself a neat scotch. This marriage has been a ghost town for years, Ellie. You're happy in your garden, reading your books, living in the past. I am a man who is still building, still growing. Vanessa. Vanessa understands the pressure I'm under. She speaks my language. She makes me feel alive. She makes you feel young, I corrected him. the bitterness finally leaking into my tone. And what happens now? You brought her into my home to what? To mark her territory? He took a slow sip of his scotch. I brought her here because we are civilized adults, and because I wanted to prepare you. I'm filing for divorce on Monday, Eleanor. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. Divorce? After 42 years? Just like that? It's not just like that, he snapped, his temper flaring. I've spent 4 decades providing for you. I built a multi-million-dollar company so you could sit in this air-conditioned house and prune your roses. I've done my duty. Now it's my turn to be happy. You built? The injustice of his words sparked a fire in my chest. Harrison, you couldn't read a topographical map when we met. Those were my designs, my systems. I gave up my career. Stop! He barked, slamming his glass down on the counter. Do not rewrite history to make yourself the martyr, Eleanor. You drew some pretty pictures in the 80s. I am the one who took the risks. I am the one who secured the loans, managed the crews, built the client list. My name is on the door. My name is on the LLC. My name is on the deed to this house. He stepped closer to me, towering over my frame, his face a mask of cold determination. I have already spoken to my lawyers. I am offering you a very generous settlement. $3,000 a month in alimony, the Volvo, and $50,000 in cash to help you find a nice quiet condo somewhere. If you sign the papers quickly and quietly, we can keep this amicable. $50,000? I breathed, staring at him in disbelief. Vance estate is worth at least $8 million. This house is worth $2 million. And you want to toss me out with pocket change? Harrison leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Listen to me very carefully, Ellie. I have spent the last 8 months working with Vanessa to restructure everything. The assets are protected. The cash reserves are tied up in corporate trusts that you have no legal access to. If you fight me, if you try to drag my name through the mud or take what is mine, my lawyers will bury you. I will drag this out until you are bankrupt. You will walk away with nothing. He wasn't bluffing. The chilling certainty in his voice told me this had been meticulously planned. Vanessa hadn't just been warming his bed. She had been acting as his financial hitman, systematically draining the marital assets, moving the pieces on the board while I was busy making sure his dinners were hot. You're a monster, I whispered. I'm a businessman, he replied coldly. Pack a bag, Eleanor. You can stay at the Marriott tonight. I don't want to look at you right now. He turned his back on me and walked upstairs to our bedroom, leaving me alone in the kitchen I had designed, in the house I had turned into a home, suddenly a stranger in my own life. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound for tears. I walked mechanistically upstairs, packed a small suitcase, and drove into the Austin night. The next morning, sitting in a sterile hotel room with a lukewarm cup of coffee, I realized I needed an anchor. I needed my family. I picked up my phone and called my son, Matthew. Matthew was 40, a vice president at Vance Estate, being groomed to take over. He was Harrison's golden boy, but he had always been my sweet, sensitive child. I needed him to know what his father had done. I needed an ally. Mom? Matthew answered, his voice sounding oddly tight. Are you okay? Where are you? Matthew, I'm at the Marriott downtown, I said, my voice finally trembling. Your father, he's filed for divorce. He's been having an affair with that consultant, Vanessa. He kicked me out last night and told me he's hidden all the money. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. Matthew, are you there? Mom, I know. The 2 words hung in the air, disjointed and surreal. You know? What do you mean you know? Did he call you this morning? No, Mom. Matthew's voice dropped, filled with a sickening mix of guilt and defensiveness. I've known about Vanessa for about 6 months. I stopped breathing. The hotel room spun around me. You knew your father was sleeping with another woman? You knew he was planning to leave me with nothing, and you didn't tell me? Mom, please try to understand, Matthew pleaded, his voice cracking. Dad sat me down. He told me the marriage was over a long time ago. He said you guys were basically roommates. And, Mom, he made it clear that the transition of the company depended on this going smoothly. If I caused a scene, if I took sides, he threatened to sell the company to an outside equity firm. My future, my kids' futures. I couldn't risk it. He promised he was going to take care of you financially. He offered me $50,000, Matthew, for 42 years of my life. He said it would be millions, Matthew stammered, realizing the depth of the lies he had swallowed. Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought he was being fair. You chose his money over your mother, I said, my voice completely hollow. Mom, don't say that. I hung up the phone. The betrayal of a husband is a knife to the heart, but the betrayal of a child? That is an entirely different kind of violence. It shatters the very foundation of your existence. Harrison hadn't just stolen my past and my financial security. He had bought my son. He had systematically isolated me, stripping away my family, my home, and my dignity, leaving me naked in the cold. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at my aged hands. Harrison Vance thought he had won. He and his brilliant, ruthless mistress thought they had outsmarted a naive, docile old woman. They thought I was just a gardener, a cook, a relic of the past who would quietly fade away into obscurity, too scared and too tired to fight back. They forgot one fundamental truth. Before I was a wife, before I was a mother, I was the architect. I was the one who drew the blueprints. I knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were hidden, and if Harrison Vance wanted to tear down my life, I was going to make damn sure his entire empire collapsed on top of him. The first few weeks after my world collapsed were a blur of cardboard boxes and the stale smell of cheap carpet. I couldn't afford to stay at the Marriott indefinitely, not with my joint credit cards suddenly suspended and my access to our main accounts locked behind a wall of corporate legalities. I found a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Austin, a place where the air conditioning rattled violently every time it kicked on, and the view from the single window was a cracked parking lot. It was a staggering fall from grace. Just a month prior, I had been hosting charity galas in a $2 million home, directing catering staff and arranging centerpieces. Now I was eating canned soup on a folding chair, staring at the peeling wallpaper, trying to understand how 42 years of devotion could be erased with a single signature on a restructuring document. Depression is a heavy, suffocating blanket. For the first fortnight, I barely left the apartment. I let my phone ring out. I ignored the emails from Harrison's attorneys, cold and clinical messages urging me to accept the $50,000 buyout in the interest of an amicable dissolution. They were trying to starve me out. They knew I had no income of my own, no retirement fund in my name. They were counting on my fear and my exhaustion to force my hand. And for a brief, terrible moment, it almost worked. The sheer exhaustion of betrayal made me want to curl up into a ball and disappear. I was 69. The thought of starting over, of fighting a multi-million-dollar corporation and a ruthless 36-year-old financial shark, felt impossible. But then, Clara arrived. My daughter, Clara, was 38, a fierce, fiercely independent pediatric nurse who had never quite fit into the polished country club mold her father so desperately craved. Unlike Matthew, who had been bought and paid for with a C-suite title, Clara was entirely her own woman. She banged on my apartment door on a rainy Tuesday evening, her arms loaded with heavy cardboard boxes. When I opened the door, looking disheveled and hollow-eyed, she didn't offer empty platitudes. She marched in, dropped the boxes on the linoleum floor with a heavy thud, and pulled me into a fierce, bone-crushing hug. "I tried to get more of your things," Clara said, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "But Dad had the locks changed at the house. He actually hired a security guard for the front gate, Mom. Like you're some kind of criminal." I pulled away, wiping a stray tear. "It's his house, Clara. His name is on the deed." "It's a house you made a home," Clara snapped, pacing the small living room like a caged panther. "I went to his office yesterday. I marched right past his receptionist and into the boardroom. He was sitting there with that parasite, Vanessa. I told him exactly what I thought of him. I told him he was a coward and a thief." "Clara, honey, you shouldn't have done that. He could cut you off." "Let him!" She threw her hands in the air. "I don't want his dirty money, Mom, and I sure as hell don't want anything to do with Matthew. I can't believe my own brother covered this up. He sold you out for a promotion." Clara stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective fire. "But you are not going to let them win, Mom. You are not going to take that insulting settlement. We will fight him. I have savings. I'll hire you a lawyer. A ruthless one." "A divorce lawyer won't help, sweetie," I sighed, gesturing to the stack of legal papers on the counter. "Harrison's lawyers are corporate giants. They've spent 8 months burying the assets in shell LLCs and offshore trusts. Vanessa made sure of it. On paper, Harrison is technically broke, and Vance Estate Landscaping is owned by a holding company. A family court judge will look at the paperwork and give me exactly what they offered. Clara looked at the boxes she had brought. Well, I packed up the study before the locks were changed. I grabbed your books, your personal files, and all those old leather trunks you kept in the back closet. I didn't know what was in them, but I knew Dad never looked in there. I looked at the scuffed leather trunks sitting in the corner of the room. They were relics from a lifetime ago. They were my garden journals. That night after Clara left, I couldn't sleep. The rain was lashing against the thin glass of my window. I made a cup of chamomile tea, sat cross-legged on the faded carpet, and unlatched the first leather trunk. The smell of aged paper, graphite, and dried pressed flowers drifted up, the scent of my youth, of my forgotten ambition. I pulled out the heavy leather-bound sketchbooks. These weren't just diaries. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, before Vance Estate Landscaping was a corporate behemoth, I had spent thousands of hours developing proprietary designs. I flipped through the vellum pages, my fingers tracing the intricate, hand-drawn blueprints of cascading water features, specialized retaining walls, and drought-resistant ecological layouts that had put our company on the map. And then, I found it. Tucked into the back pocket of a journal from 1983 was a thick manila envelope. My heart began to beat a little faster as I pulled out the crisp official documents inside. They were patents. When Harrison and I first started, he was the salesman, but he had no technical expertise. I had invented a unique subterranean drip irrigation system designed specifically for the arid Texas climate. It saved water, prevented root rot, and was revolutionary for high-end residential landscaping. At the time, Harrison had been too busy schmoozing clients to deal with the paperwork. "You file it, Ellie," he had said dismissively over coffee one morning in 1983. "Use your name. It's your little invention anyway." And I had. I stared at the faded ink on the United States Patent and Trademark Office certificates. They weren't registered to Vance Estate Landscaping. They weren't registered to Harrison Vance. They were registered to Eleanor Sterling, my maiden name. My breath caught in my throat. I dug deeper into the trunk, my hands shaking with a sudden electrifying surge of adrenaline. I found the copyright registrations for our signature architectural landscape blueprints. I found the original trademark filing for the Vance Estate interlocking V logo, which I had sketched myself. All of it. Every single piece of foundational intellectual property that the entire $8 million company rested upon was registered exclusively in my maiden name. Harrison had been so focused on hiding the cash, so obsessed with moving the real estate into shell companies with Vanessa's help, that he had completely forgotten about the invisible architecture of his own empire. He had spent 40 years treating my contributions as pretty little doodles, and had never bothered to transfer the IP rights over to the corporate entity. He didn't own the designs. He didn't own the irrigation technology that was currently installed in over 300 luxury estates across Texas. He didn't even own the logo on his business cards. I did. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in a month. Harrison thought he had locked me out of the castle. He didn't realize I held the deed to the land the castle was built on. The next morning, I didn't call a divorce attorney. I called the most aggressive, high-stakes intellectual property and corporate litigation firm in Austin. Marcus Thorne did not look like a man you wanted to cross. He was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed, with eyes like a hawk, and a reputation for financially eviscerating his opponents in court. When I walked into his glass-paneled office overlooking the Austin skyline, clutching my worn leather trunk, his receptionist gave me a skeptical look. But Marcus agreed to a consultation. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and didn't mention my broken heart. I didn't cry about my husband's infidelity or my son's betrayal. I spoke the only language Harrison and Vanessa respected: assets, liabilities, and leverage. I opened the trunk and laid the patent certificates, the copyright registrations, and the original blueprints on his desk. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice steady and cold, "my husband is attempting to divorce me and leave me destitute. He claims the corporation, Vance Estate Landscaping, is solely his. I am here to prove that without my permission, Vance Estate Landscaping does not have the legal right to operate." Marcus Thorne picked up the patent from 1983. He looked at the blueprints. He looked at the trademark filing. Then he looked at me, his eyebrows slowly rising. Mrs. Vance, or should I say Ms. Sterling, Marcus said, a genuine note of reverence in his voice. Does your husband have a licensing agreement with you to use these patents and designs? No, I replied simply. He never thought they were important enough to legally acquire. He's been using them for commercial profit for 40 years, completely free of charge. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. A predatory smile touched his lips. If what you are showing me holds up, your husband hasn't just marginalized you in a divorce. He and his company have been committing massive intellectual property infringement for 4 decades. If we issue a cease and desist, his company cannot legally execute a single one of their current contracts. I don't just want a cease and desist, Mr. Thorne, I said, leaning forward. I want a forensic accountant. My husband's mistress, Vanessa Hayes, is a financial consultant. She's been moving corporate assets to hide them from the divorce proceedings. I want every single ledger, every offshore account, every hidden trust ripped wide open. I want to know exactly what she's done with my money. Marcus's eyes gleamed. He loved a bloodbath. Consider it done, Eleanor. We won't even file this in family court yet. We're going to hit them in federal court with a massive IP lawsuit and use discovery to force open their financial books. We will freeze every asset they have. Over the next 3 months, while Marcus Thorne and his team of forensic bloodhounds went to work, I played the part of the defeated wife perfectly. Harrison and Vanessa grew increasingly arrogant. They were entirely convinced they had won. I received text messages from Harrison that were dripping with condescension. Ellie, the $50,000 offer expires on Friday. Don't be stubborn. You can't afford to fight me. Sign the papers and you can finally buy some new gardening gloves. H. I didn't reply. I just forwarded the messages to Marcus. Let them think I was cowering in my apartment. Let them bask in their false victory. While they were picking out custom Italian tile for Vanessa's new condo, paid for no doubt by Vance estate funds, Marcus's forensic accountant, a brilliant woman named Sarah, was systematically dismantling Vanessa's intricate financial web. It turned out Vanessa Hayes was exactly what I thought she was, only much worse. Sarah called me into the office on a brisk morning in January. Marcus was grinning like a shark who had just smelled blood in the water. Eleanor, have a seat, Marcus said, gesturing to the chair. You were right about Ms. Hayes. She is very good at hiding money. She created 3 different shell LLCs in Delaware and funneled nearly $2 million of Vance Estate's liquid capital into them, claiming them as consulting fees and restructuring costs. So she hid the money for Harrison, I said, nodding. Just as I suspected. Yes, but here is the brilliant part, Sarah interjected, sliding a thick file across the table. She didn't just hide it for Harrison. She hid it from Harrison. I frowned, looking at the documents. I don't understand. Vanessa Hayes set up those offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Sarah explained, tapping a specific line of code on a printed bank statement. But Harrison Vance is not a signatory on any of those accounts. Only Vanessa is. She convinced your husband to move the company's liquid assets to protect them from you in the divorce. But legally, she stole the money from him. She's bleeding his company dry, and he is too blinded by her to realize she's preparing her own golden parachute. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal washing over me. Harrison had thrown away 42 years of loyalty for a woman who was actively embezzling from him. He had thought he was the mastermind, the silver fox outsmarting his aging wife. In reality, he was nothing more than an aging, gullible mark in a long con orchestrated by a woman half his age. We have them, Eleanor, Marcus said softly, his voice vibrating with lethal anticipation. We have absolute proof of corporate embezzlement by Vanessa Hayes. We have proof of fraudulent concealment of marital assets by Harrison Vance. And we have an ironclad intellectual property claim that can shut down Vance Estate landscaping by the end of the week. What do you want to do? I looked out the window at the Austin skyline, the city where I had raised my children, where I had built a legacy in the shadows, where I had been cast aside like garbage. I thought of my son, Matthew, sitting in his vice president's chair, entirely complicit. I thought of Harrison's mocking text messages. I thought of Vanessa rubbing her foot against my husband's leg at my own dining table. I turned back to Marcus, my voice as hard and unyielding as Texas limestone. Spring the trap, Marcus. File the injunction. Freeze their accounts. Let's burn it all down. Gemini and I. The strike happened on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of a brutal Texas heat wave. It was a day carefully chosen by Marcus Thorne. That Tuesday was meant to be the crowning achievement of Harrison's recent career, the official groundbreaking ceremony for the new Silicon Valley Tech campus relocating to Austin. It was a $5 million landscaping contract, the crown jewel of Vance Estates' portfolio, and Harrison was determined to use the press coverage to solidify his absolute control over the company. I wasn't there, of course. I was sitting in Marcus's downtown office, sipping black coffee, watching the digital clock on the wall tick toward 10 a.m. According to the timeline Marcus had mapped out, Harrison would just be stepping up to the podium, wearing a hard hat over his silver hair, a shiny golden shovel in his hand, ready to smile for the local news cameras. Vanessa would undoubtedly be standing just off camera, looking sleek and victorious, mentally calculating her next illicit transfer. At exactly 10:05 a.m., Marcus's desk phone rang. He picked it up, listened for 3 seconds, and hung up. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. "The injunctions have been served, Eleanor," Marcus said softly. Simultaneously, at the groundbreaking ceremony, at the Vance Estate corporate headquarters, and at 3 different banking institutions. The trap is officially sprung. Later, Clara would tell me what had happened through the grapevine of the firm's panicked employees. A process server, dressed in a wrinkled beige suit that completely ruined the aesthetic of the luxury groundbreaking, had walked right past the velvet ropes. He had handed Harrison a thick stack of legal documents right as the cameras flashed. At that exact moment, across town, federal marshals walked into the Vance Estate headquarters to deliver a cease and desist order, demanding the immediate halt of all operations using proprietary technology patented by Eleanor Sterling. Concurrently, the banking institutions received court orders to freeze every single corporate and personal account linked to Harrison Vance, pending an investigation into fraudulent concealment of marital assets. The illusion of Harrison's untouchable empire evaporated in less than 5 minutes. My burner phone, the only one I kept turned on, started ringing furiously 20 minutes later. The caller ID flashed my son's name, Matthew. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath to steady my nerves, and answered. "Hello, Matthew." Mom, what the hell is going on?" Matthew's voice was pitched an octave higher than usual, frantic and entirely stripped of his usual corporate arrogance. "The corporate accounts are locked. Payroll is frozen. Some federal marshal just walked into the drafting room and told the entire design team to drop their pencils and step away from the servers. They're saying we're violating federal intellectual property laws." "You are," I replied, my voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of the maternal warmth he was accustomed to. "Vance Estate Landscaping is operating using stolen intellectual property. The patents and copyrights do not belong to the corporation. They belong to me." "You?" Matthew let out a hysterical, breathless laugh. "Mom, you're a housewife. You don't have patents. Dad is losing his mind. He's screaming at those lawyers in the boardroom right now. You have to call this off, whatever stunt this is. You are going to ruin the company. You're going to ruin my future." The sheer entitlement in his voice extinguished any lingering guilt I might have felt. He didn't care about the 42 years of my life his father had thrown away. He only cared about his inheritance. "Your future, Matthew, was built on my past," I said coldly. "And since you chose to align yourself with a man who thought $50,000 was an acceptable price for my lifetime of loyalty, I suggest you ask him how to fix this. Tell your father my lawyer is Marcus Thorne. If Harrison wants his company back, he can come crawl to Marcus's office. Do not call me again." I hung up and turned the phone off. I looked at Marcus. "They're panicking." "Good," Marcus adjusted his cuffs. "Let them sweat. By tomorrow morning, the reality of their situation will have fully set in." It didn't take until tomorrow morning. It took exactly 4 hours. At 2:30 p.m., the heavy glass doors of Marcus Thorne's firm swung open. Harrison Vance marched in, a storm cloud in a tailored suit. The Golden Boy CEO facade was entirely gone. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, his tie was loosened, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. Trailing behind him was Matthew, looking pale and nauseous, and Vanessa Hayes, whose usual predatory swagger had been replaced by a tight, rigid anxiety. They were escorted into the grand conference room where Marcus and I were already seated. I didn't stand up. I didn't flinch. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, looking at the man I had once thought was my entire world. "Eleanor!" Harrison roared the moment the door clicked shut. He slammed his hands down on the polished wood of the table. "Have you lost your goddamn mind? What is this garbage you filed? A cease and desist? Intellectual property theft? I built that company from the dirt up." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He simply opened a leather folder and slid a copy of the 1983 United States Patent Office certificate across the table. "Mr. Vance, I strongly suggest you lower your voice. You are currently in the presence of the sole legal owner of the subterranean drip irrigation system that your company is currently contracted to install in a $5 million tech campus. A system, I might add, that you have been installing illegally for 4 decades without paying a single dime in licensing fees to my client." Harrison sneered, barely glancing at the paper. "That's a clerical error. We were married. What's hers is mine. It's marital property. Any family court judge will laugh you out of the room." "Actually," Marcus smiled, a terrifying display of teeth, "intellectual property registered under a maiden name prior to corporate incorporation, without a formal transfer of rights, is heavily protected under federal law, not state family law. Vance Estate Landscaping is a separate legal entity, an entity that has been commercially profiting off Eleanor Sterling's patents. The back-owed licensing fees, compounded with penalties for willful infringement, total approximately $14 million. Your company is mathematically bankrupt, Mr. Vance." Harrison stared at the document. His eyes flicked to the name Eleanor Sterling. For the first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed his face. He looked at Matthew, who was staring at the floor, and then he looked at Vanessa. Vanessa stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She was trying to regain control. "This is an obvious extortion attempt," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Harrison, don't let them intimidate you. The corporate structure is solid. We have significant liquid reserves. We will simply bond around the injunction, tie this up in litigation for 10 years, and starve her out. She doesn't have the capital to sustain a protracted federal lawsuit." Harrison nodded, his chest puffing out again, bolstered by his mistress's confidence. "Exactly. You want to play hardball, Ellie? Fine. We'll buy you out. I'll authorize a one-time payment of $500,000 for the patents and your silence. Take it or leave it, but know that if you leave it, I will bury you in legal fees until you die in that pathetic little apartment." I looked at Vanessa. I looked at the tailored navy suit she was wearing, the expensive blowout, the diamond tennis bracelet catching the light, all paid for by the sweat of my youth. "You can't buy me out, Harrison," I said softly, the silence in the room amplifying my words. "Because you don't have any money." Harrison let out a sharp, barking laugh. "I run an $8 million firm, Eleanor. I think I can find $500,000 in the couch cushions." Marcus slid a second, much thicker folder across the table. "I believe what my client means, Mr. Vance, is that your liquid capital no longer exists. Or rather, it no longer exists where you think it does." Harrison frowned, reaching for the folder, but Vanessa's hand shot out, her fingers digging into his forearm. "Harrison, don't look at that. It's fabricated. They're just trying to confuse you." Her voice was entirely too sharp, teetering on the edge of panic. Harrison looked at her, his brow furrowing. For a man who had been utterly blind for the past year, the sudden desperation in her eyes finally registered. He pulled his arm away and opened the folder. Inside were the forensic accounting reports, page after page of wire transfers, corporate ledger discrepancies, and bank statements. "During the discovery phase for the injunction," Marcus explained, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather, "our forensic accounting team audited the recent restructuring of Vance Estate, the restructuring you hired Ms. Hayes to execute." Harrison's eyes darted frantically across the columns of numbers. These are the tax shelters, the Delaware LLCs. Vanessa set these up to protect the cash reserves from the divorce settlement." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "She did set them up, but did you ever check the signatory rights on those Delaware LLCs, Mr. Vance?" Harrison froze. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile, hollowed-out old man. "Those LLCs," Marcus continued mercilessly, "are wholly owned by 3 offshore trusts located in the Cayman Islands, and the sole beneficiary and signatory of those trusts is Vanessa Hayes. Over the past 8 months, Ms. Hayes has systematically embezzled roughly $2.4 million of Vance Estate's liquid capital. She didn't hide the money from your wife, Harrison. She stole it from you." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a bomb detonating in a vacuum. Harrison slowly lifted his head and looked at Vanessa. The confident, arrogant titan of industry was gone. In his place was a 71-year-old man who suddenly realized he had jumped out of an airplane without a parachute, handing the ripcord to the woman standing next to him. "Vanessa?" Harrison's voice was a ragged whisper. "Tell me this is a trick. Tell me this is one of their lies." Vanessa didn't look at him. She looked at me. And in her dark eyes I saw the cold, calculated truth. She didn't love him. She had never loved him. He was a mark, an aging, ego-driven fool who had been too busy trying to prove his virility to notice the vulture picking his bones clean. When Vanessa finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of the warmth and deference she usually reserved for him. "You signed the authorization forms, Harrison," she said, her tone clinical and detached. "You gave me full power of attorney to restructure the assets. It's not embezzlement if the CEO authorizes the transfers. You were too busy trying to hide money from your wife to read the fine print." Harrison staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He bumped into the conference table, knocking over a glass of water. It shattered on the floor, the sound sharp like a gunshot. "You bitch," Matthew breathed, stepping forward, his fists clenched. He finally saw the reality. The inheritance he had betrayed his mother for was gone, stolen by the woman standing right next to him. "Careful, Matthew," Vanessa sneered, adjusting her designer handbag. "I am the only one who has access to the capital that can keep you out of bankruptcy. But unfortunately, I don't think I'll be investing in Vance Estate anymore. The company is, as Mr. Thorne pointed out, mathematically bankrupt. And frankly, Harrison, you are exhausting." She turned toward the door. "You can't leave!" Harrison screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, a pathetic mixture of rage and utter despair. "I left my wife for you. I gave you everything." Vanessa paused with her hand on the brass doorknob. She looked back at him, her expression a mask of pure pity. "No, Harrison," she said smoothly. "You gave me your money because you thought buying me was cheaper than paying your wife what she was actually worth. You played yourself." She opened the door and walked out, her heels clicking away down the marble hallway, taking his pride, his fortune, and his delusion with her. Harrison collapsed into one of the leather chairs. He put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Matthew stood frozen, staring at his father in disgust, before turning his gaze to me. "Mom," Matthew started, his voice cracking. "Mom, please. We didn't know." I looked at my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep, the man who had sold my future for a corner office. And then I looked at the broken man in the chair, the man who had thrown me away like an old coat. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy, but I also felt no pity. The fragile, terrified woman who had been kicked out of her home into a rainy night was gone, buried under the ashes of their hubris. In her place was the architect, and I was about to redraw the final blueprints of their ruin. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room, "prepare the filings for federal court. I want the company liquidated. I want my patents returned. And I want the district attorney notified of corporate fraud. We take it all." The gears of federal justice, once set into motion, grind with a terrifying, absolute finality. For 42 years, Harrison had operated under the assumption that he was the smartest man in any room. He believed that power was loud, that it wore tailored suits and shouted orders in boardrooms. He never understood that true power is quiet. It is patient. It is the meticulous documentation of a woman who knows her own worth. Within 72 hours of our meeting in Marcus Thorne's office, Vance Estate Landscaping effectively ceased to exist. The federal injunction on my intellectual property meant that the company could not fulfill a single contract. The $5 million tech campus project was immediately canceled, resulting in catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits from the developers. Panic swept through the corporate headquarters like wildfire. Employees packed their desks. The shiny fleet of company trucks sat idle in the impound lot, chained to the asphalt by court orders. Harrison tried to fight, of course. He hired a criminal defense attorney, desperately trying to untangle himself from the financial web Vanessa had woven. But the forensic evidence was irrefutable. By granting Vanessa full, unchecked power of attorney to move corporate funds to evade a divorce settlement, he had made himself an accessory to his own corporate embezzlement and federal tax fraud. But Vanessa Hayes, the brilliant financial shark who thought she could outswim everyone, did not get the clean getaway she had envisioned. She had underestimated Marcus Thorne. When Vanessa walked out of that conference room, she had immediately booked a first-class, one-way ticket to Geneva, assuming her Cayman Island trusts were untouchable. She didn't realize that Marcus had already handed the forensic audit over to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, and the FBI. Moving $2.4 million of corporate assets into offshore accounts to defraud a spouse is a civil matter. But doing it across international borders through wire fraud while deceiving federal tax authorities? That is a federal felony. Clara called me 3 days later, her voice vibrating with dark amusement. Mom, turn on the local news. Channel 4. I turned on the small television in my rented apartment. There on the screen was the pristine, glass-fronted terminal of Austin Bergstrom International Airport. And being escorted through the automatic doors by 2 federal agents in windbreakers was Vanessa Hayes. She wasn't wearing her designer heels. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, her designer blazer draped awkwardly over her wrists to hide the metal. The terrifying poise was gone. Her face was pale, her makeup smudged, her eyes wide with the realization that the game was over. They had frozen her Cayman accounts 30 minutes before she tried to board her flight. She was left with nothing but the carry-on bag she was holding and a federal indictment for wire fraud and money laundering. Watching her being put into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle, I felt a profound sense of closure. She had tried to steal my life's work to fund her escape. Instead, she had bought herself a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. The final legal reckoning came in early November, the air in Austin finally turning crisp. We didn't even need to go to trial. Faced with federal prison time for tax evasion, the total liquidation of his company, and a $14 million intellectual property lawsuit he could never pay, Harrison surrendered unconditionally. The settlement agreement was drawn up in Marcus's office. Harrison sat across from me, looking 20 years older. The silver fox was gone. His posture was slouched, the expensive suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. He looked like exactly what he was, a broken, bankrupt old man who had traded his legacy for an illusion. To satisfy the debt owed to me for decades of stolen patents and the embezzled marital funds, the court awarded me absolute sole ownership of all remaining liquid assets, the intellectual property, and the entire real estate portfolio, including the house. My house. Sign here, Mr. Vance, Marcus said, his voice devoid of pity, tapping a gold pen on the final page of the settlement. Harrison picked up the pen. His hand was trembling so violently he could barely form the letters of his own name. He looked up at me, his eyes wet, pleading for a mercy he had never shown me. Ellie, he whispered, his voice cracking. I have nothing. The IRS is taking my pension to cover the penalties. I'm moving into a studio apartment by the highway. Please. 42 years, doesn't it count for anything? I looked at him, feeling the absolute stillness in my own heart. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind only polished steel. It counted for everything, Harrison, I said softly. It was the foundation of your entire life. But you were the one who decided it was only worth $50,000. I'm simply adjusting the market value. He signed the paper, dropped the pen, and wept. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked out of the room without looking back. The hardest boundary to draw, however, was not with my ex-husband. It was with my son. A week after the settlement was finalized, I heard a knock at the door of my small apartment. I opened it to find Matthew standing in the hallway. He looked exhausted, stripped of his arrogant corporate veneer. He was holding a bouquet of yellow tulips, my least favorite flower. He didn't even know that. Mom, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Can I come in? I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. No, Matthew, you can't. He blinked, tears springing to his eyes. Mom, please. I lost my job. The company is liquidated. Clara won't return my calls, and Dad is facing criminal charges. I have a mortgage I can't pay. I made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. I was scared and Dad manipulated me. I'm so sorry. I looked at my son. It broke my heart to see him in pain, but the mother who would have blindly shielded him from the consequences of his own actions had died the night I was kicked out of my home. You are 40 years old, Matthew, I said, my voice steady but undeniably sad. You weren't manipulated. You calculated. You weighed the value of your mother against the title of CEO, and you made a choice. You helped your father try to leave me destitute so you could inherit a stolen empire. I was trying to protect my family, he pleaded, stepping forward. I was your family, I corrected him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I love you, Matthew. I will always love you because you are my son. But I do not trust you, and I will not allow people who betray me to sit at my table no matter who they are. You need to go home to your wife and figure out how to rebuild your life on your own. I gently but firmly closed the door. I leaned against the cheap wood, closed my eyes, and let out a long breath. It hurt. It hurt terribly. But healing a wound properly sometimes requires searing the edges. 3 weeks later, on a bright, crystal-clear Texas morning, I drove my car through the familiar wrought iron gates of the estate. The house stood exactly as I had left it, an imposing, beautiful structure of limestone and glass. But it felt different now. The heavy, oppressive shadow of Harrison's ego had been lifted. The security guards were gone. The locks had been changed back. Clara was waiting for me on the front porch, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She smiled brightly as I walked up the pathway, handing me a mug. "Welcome home, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek. "It feels strange," I admitted, looking up at the grand entryway. "There are parts of this house that I despise, parts that just scream of his arrogance." I pointed to the massive, tacky marble pillars Harrison had insisted on installing near the patio to make the house look like a Roman villa, completely ruining the natural, ecological aesthetic I had originally designed. Clara grinned, reaching into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a pair of thick safety glasses and a small, heavy sledgehammer with a bright yellow handle. "I thought you might say that," she laughed, handing them to me. "I hired contractors to come tomorrow to do the heavy lifting, but I figured you deserved the first swing." I looked at the sledgehammer in my hands. A fierce, brilliant joy ignited in my chest. I set my coffee down on the porch railing, put on the safety glasses, and walked over to the hideous marble pillar. I thought about the night Harrison told me I was a boring old woman. I thought about Vanessa's foot under my dining table. I thought about the $50,000 offer designed to make me disappear into obscurity. I gripped the handle, pulled the hammer back, and swung with every ounce of strength in my 69-year-old body. The steel head connected with the marble with a thunderous crack. A massive chunk of the stone splintered and crashed to the patio floor, kicking up a cloud of white dust. Clara cheered, clapping her hands. I laughed, a loud, clear, unburdened sound that echoed across the empty estate. I swung again and again until my arms ached and the pillar was nothing but jagged ruins. When I was finally done, I dropped the hammer, breathing heavily, feeling the cool autumn breeze on my face. I looked out over the expansive backyard. The heritage roses, my Chrysler Imperials, were still there, waiting to be pruned. The soil was waiting to be turned. There is a profound misconception in our society that a woman's life ends when her youth fades. They tell us that after 60, we are meant to be invisible. We are meant to be the quiet grandmothers, the background characters in other people's stories. They expect us to surrender. But what Harrison Vance and men like him fail to understand is that the women who have spent decades quietly building the foundations of their lives are not weak. We are structural engineers. We know the weight-bearing loads of a family, of a business, of a life. And if you try to demolish us, you will find out very quickly that we are made of steel and reinforced concrete. I walked into the house, my house, and left the front door wide open to let the fresh air in. I was 69 years old. My husband was gone, my empire had been razed and returned to me, and my hands were still strong enough to plant a new garden. My name is Eleanor Sterling. I am the architect of my own life, and I am just getting started.